You think the dollar's dominance is permanent? The central bank for central banks just quietly handed operational control of a new digital payment network to nations actively trying to bypass the Western financial system. They aren't just talking about replacing the dollar anymore. They have built the plumbing to actually do it. Honestly, most people never notice this kind of shift happening in real time. We're so used to the US dollar being the invisible air we breathe in global trade that we treat it like a permanent law of physics. But if you step back and look at the actual infrastructure being laid down right now, the reality gets very uncomfortable very fast. Picture this: billions of dollars in cross-border trade settling instantly. It doesn't touch New York, it doesn't route through the SWIFT network, it completely bypasses the US banking apparatus. And the strangest part? This isn't some rogue underground project. It was co-developed by the Bank for International Settlements itself. Financial empires rarely announce their own end. The press releases don't say, "We're losing control." Instead, the plumbing just quietly changes. And right now, the pipes are being completely rerouted. Let's look at the actual mechanics of why this is happening. To understand why the world is building new pipes, we have to look at the old ones, and frankly, they're starting to burst. Most people think the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is just a natural byproduct of winning World War II, but the system we live in today isn't actually that old. It really traces back to a specific, desperate moment in 1971. That was the year President Nixon temporarily suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. At that moment, the dollar lost its anchor to anything physical. It became a promise, a floating piece of paper backed only by faith and credit. But faith is a fragile thing to build a global empire on. So, the US struck a deal that changed history. They went to Saudi Arabia and reached an agreement. The Saudis would price oil exclusively in dollars, and in exchange, the US would provide military protection and a steady supply of US Treasuries for the Saudis to park their profits in. This was the birth of the Petrodollar. It created a forced global demand for the dollar. If you wanted to run a modern economy, if you wanted to keep the lights on, you had to hold dollars. But here's the part most people miss. This arrangement wasn't just a clever diplomatic move, it was a mathematical contract. For 50 years, the world sent us real goods, oil, electronics, clothing, and in return, we sent them digital entries on a ledger. We sent them debt. Honestly, this is the uncomfortable part of the autopsy. The system worked perfectly as long as the rest of the world was willing to absorb that debt. But today, the math is starting to break. When you look at the US national debt, now surging past $34 trillion, and you realize that interest payments alone are starting to eclipse the defense budget, you start to see why other nations are getting nervous. If you step back and look at the incentives, why would a foreign central bank continue to hold a paper asset that is being devalued by trillions of dollars in new printing every year? Especially when the faith and credit of that system is increasingly being used as a geopolitical weapon. The 1970s handshake served its purpose, but we are reaching the end of that mathematical runway. The world isn't just hating on America, they're looking at an Excel spreadsheet and realizing that the collateral for the global economy is looking more like a liability every day. And that brings us to the moment the faith started to fail and the search for a new anchor began. Usually, when a global power shift happens, you expect noise. You expect sanctions, press conferences, maybe even military posturing. But the most significant threat to the US dollar supremacy didn't materialize on a battlefield or a debate stage. It happened quietly, buried in technical white papers and beta tests, orchestrated from a sterile office in Basel, Switzerland. Let's look at what is actually happening with Project mBridge. To the average person, multi-CBDC platform sounds like a boring bureaucratic phrase. It's designed to sound boring. But if you strip away the jargon and look at the forensic reality, mBridge is a direct, decentralized payment highway between central banks. For decades, the global financial system operated on a hub-and-spoke model. If a bank in Thailand wanted to pay a supplier in the UAE, the transaction almost always routed through a correspondent bank in New York. It cleared in US dollars. That choke point is what gave the US its exorbitant privilege. It allowed Washington to see every major transaction, tax it via fees, and most importantly, weaponize it. If they didn't like your politics, they could sever your connection to the SWIFT network, effectively banishing your economy from global trade. When Russia's dollar reserves were frozen in 2022, it sent a silent shockwave through every non-Western central bank. They realized that if their national savings were held in Western institutions, they weren't actually assets, they were conditional IOUs. mBridge completely flattens that geometry. It allows central banks to settle cross-border trade instantly, 24/7, using their own local currencies on a shared digital ledger. No middleman, no correspondent banks in New York, no dollars required. Now here's the part that feels genuinely surreal. This technology wasn't hacked together by rogue states trying to evade sanctions in secret. It was funded, nurtured, and developed under the umbrella of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, the literal central bank of central banks, the very anchor of the Western financial order. Think about the sheer irony of that. The institution tasked with maintaining global financial stability essentially built a customized lifeboat for nations actively trying to abandon the dollar. And then, just recently, the BIS quietly announced it was stepping back from the operational side of mBridge. They handed the fully functional plumbing over to the participating members, nations like China, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Personally, this is where the official narrative of a strong, irreplaceable dollar starts becoming very difficult to trust. It feels like watching the architect of a prison hand the master blueprints to the inmates and then casually walk away. What makes this new system so dangerous to the old guard isn't just geopolitical spite, it's cold, hard efficiency. Under the legacy SWIFT system, settling a cross-border trade could take 3 to 5 days, trapping capital and bleeding profits through intermediary fees. mBridge does it in seconds for pennies. If you are a manufacturer in Indonesia or a commodities trader in Brazil, you don't necessarily care about the philosophy of fiat currency. You care about margin and risk. If you're offered a way to get paid instantly without the looming threat of your funds being frozen by a foreign government thousands of miles away, which system are you realistically going to choose? This is what I mean when I say the plumbing is changing. People are distracted by political theater while the actual pipes of the global economy are being permanently rerouted. The world is transitioning from a system requiring permission to a system governed by protocol. And once that infrastructure is fully lit up, you don't even need to orchestrate a dramatic attack on the dollar. You just stop needing it. But a digital ledger still requires something tangible to back it up if it wants to be trusted globally. And that brings us to the most ancient form of collateral, the one central banks are suddenly hoarding at record levels.
But a digital ledger, no matter how fast or decentralized it is only as good as the value it carries, and right now, trust is a vanishing commodity. This brings us to the actual payload moving through these new pipes. For years, the financial media laughed at the idea of a BRICS currency. They pointed out, quite rightly, that these nations have vastly different economies and political interests, but while the West was waiting for a competitor to the dollar bill, these nations were building something else entirely, a settlement unit. It's often referred to simply as the unit. Personally, this is where I find the most forensic evidence of a structural shift. The proposal isn't for a common currency you'd keep in your wallet to buy groceries. It's a trade unit designed specifically for settling large-scale accounts between nations, and the math behind it is fascinating. It's reportedly backed 40% by physical gold and 60% by a basket of local currencies. Think about why that 40% matters. In the world of fiat, gold is often mocked as a barbarous relic, but in the world of central banking, gold is the only asset that is not someone else's liability. If you hold a US Treasury, you are holding a promise that the US government will tax its citizens enough to pay you back. If you hold a dollar, you're holding a promise of future purchasing power. But if you hold gold, you aren't holding a promise, you're holding the thing itself. Honestly, the return to gold feels like the global economy's version of returning to reality after a very long, very expensive party. When you look at the pilot programs testing these gold-backed units, you start to see a pattern. They aren't trying to destroy the dollar, they are trying to insulate themselves from it. By anchoring 40% of their trade unit to gold, they create a floor. It's a stabilizer. If the US prints another $5 trillion and the value of the dollar drops, that 40% gold component in the unit remains anchored to physical reality. It preserves the purchasing power of the nations involved. There's a historical precedent for this that most people have forgotten. In the late 1960s, something called the London Gold Pool collapsed. For years, a group of Western central banks tried to keep the price of gold artificially low at 35 an ounce to protect the prestige of the dollar. But eventually the math caught up with them. The world saw that the US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them, and the pool evaporated as nations rushed to trade their paper for metal. What we're seeing today is the 21st century version of that rush, but it's happening with much more sophisticated technology. If you step back and look at the incentives, it makes perfect sense. Why would Russia, China, or even the UAE want to trade their real physical commodities, oil, gas, minerals, for a paper currency that is losing 5 to 10% of its value every year to inflation? They wouldn't. They're realizing that in a world of infinite digital printing, the only way to win is to tie your trade to something that cannot be printed. I find it telling that while mainstream financial advisors were telling the public that gold was a dead asset, central banks were quietly buying it at the highest volumes since the 1960s. They aren't just buying a hedge, they are remonetizing gold. They are preparing for a world where faith and credit are no longer enough to settle the bill. But this isn't just about what they're buying, it's about what they've stopped buying. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this autopsy, the slow, methodical abandonment of the US Treasury market.
If you listen to the mainstream financial press, the argument usually goes like this. If these countries hate the dollar so much, why don't they just dump their US Treasuries? The fact that they still hold trillions proves the dollar is fine. But that's a binary way of thinking, and the world of high-stakes finance is rarely binary. Honestly, if you were a central banker holding $1 trillion in US debt, you wouldn't dump it all at once either. Doing that would be financial suicide. You'd crash the market, destroy the value of your own remaining holdings, and trigger a global catastrophe that would swallow your own economy whole. Now, you don't run for the exit, you walk, quietly, methodically. This is what I call the slow bleed. If you look at the forensic data from the Treasury Department, you see a fascinating and disturbing trend. Foreign central banks aren't necessarily selling everything they own in a panic. Instead, they are simply choosing to not show up at the auction anymore. When their old Treasury bonds mature and the US government sends them their cash back, these nations aren't rolling over that money into new debt. They're taking the cash and buying gold, or investing in the mBridge infrastructure we discussed earlier. Think about what this actually means for the United States. The US government is currently running a deficit that is, quite frankly, difficult to comprehend, trillions of dollars every year. To fund that spending, they have to sell new debt. For 50 years, the rest of the world was a hungry, reliable buyer. But now, the biggest customers are leaving the store. Personally, this is where the logic of the current system begins to break down. If the rest of the world stops buying our debt, who's left to pick up the tab? The answer is the lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve. When foreign nations stop absorbing US Treasuries, the Fed often has to step in and buy that debt itself. This is essentially the government printing money to lend it to itself. It's a closed loop, and while it keeps the lights on in Washington, it has a very real, very painful consequence for you and me. It's called monetizing the debt, and its direct byproduct is the persistent, grinding inflation we've been feeling at the grocery store and the gas pump for the last few years. Most people see inflation as a mysterious act of God or a temporary supply chain glitch, but if you step back and look at the incentives, you realize that inflation is actually the exit tax for a world that no longer wants to fund the American lifestyle. It's a quiet, invisible transfer of wealth. As foreign central banks bleed out their treasury holdings to protect their own sovereignty, the burden of that debt is being shifted onto the shoulders of the American saver. Your bank account is essentially being used as the shock absorber for a global geopolitical shift. It's not a dramatic bank run, it's a silent, structural abandonment. And once you see the math, you realize that this isn't something a single election or a minor interest rate hike can fix. The world is moving on. So the question becomes, if the most powerful institutions on Earth are changing their behavior to protect themselves from this shift, why aren't you?
So where does that leave the rest of us? It's easy to look at mBridge, the return to gold-backed settlement, and the slow bleed of the Treasury market as things that only happen in mahogany boardrooms or high-level summits. But history shows us that the macro always, eventually, becomes the micro. The decisions made by a central bank in Riyadh or Beijing today will determine the purchasing power of your savings 5 years from now. If you take one thing away from this autopsy, let it be this. Don't listen to what the institutions say. Watch what they do. They are moving away from counterparty risk. They are moving away from systems that require permission to operate. And most importantly, they are moving away from paper and toward the physical. They are building their own sovereign wealth, accumulating assets that aren't dependent on some foreign government's ability to manage their own spiraling debt. Honestly, you don't need to be a nation-state to adopt that same protocol. It's about shifting at least a portion of your reserves from promises to reality. Whether that's physical gold, silver, or assets that exist outside the traditional banking grid, the goal is identical: to stop being the shock absorber for a system that is fundamentally changing its architecture. We are entering an era where the old rules of buy and hold paper assets might not apply anymore. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar is fading, and the era of tangible collateral is returning. You can wait for the mainstream news to tell you the transition is over, or you can look at the plumbing yourself and realize the water has already stopped flowing. The choice, as always, is yours, but the smartest money in the room has already made its move. Maybe it's time we did the same.